Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Shivanan.
There is so much demand for technologists, for good technologists, who are able to understand a requirement that might not be perfect.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Welcome back to the Convergence Podcast, folks. Today, our guest, Derek Ferguson, the Chief Software Engineer from Fitch Group, joins us again for part 2 of our chat. Now, we come across great ideas, new systems, methods that maybe we've had success with that we want to drive across our team. A major challenge for companies as big as Fitch that have hundreds or thousands of developers is driving the adoption of these new systems and methods, and especially letting go of the old. On today's episode, Derek talks to us about how he fostered the adoption of 2 very relevant topics for product engineering teams today. The first is the use of generative AI to augment your team's software development. And the second is the use of the DORA set of metrics to measure the health of your product teams. On the episode, Derek shares the efficiencies that Fitch is seeing across their team from using AI-powered coding assistants like Q Developer from Amazon Web Services, which is very similar to GitHub's Copilot, I would say. And we also talk about why they chose the DORA set of metrics to measure the team's health and the gains that they're seeing from it. More importantly, though, for myself, I really love Derek's stories on how they went about fostering the experimentation and ultimately the adoption of these 2 paradigms across the team of over 600 software developers. In part 1 last week, we got to hear from Derek about a disciplined approach to creativity, as well as ways in which technology and product leadership teams can foster deep, trusted relationships with their business counterparts in order to ultimately collaborate better and ship better products faster for your customers. So make sure to check that episode out in the archives if you haven't had a chance to listen to it. At the end of today's episode, I will also share some of our past experience from Integral on some of the disciplines that your software team can adopt in order to gain a better control and improvement on your DORA metrics, if that's something that you're looking to do. So here is Derek in part 2 of our conversation. Let's tune in. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. Something that I think you mentioned about writing many books in your history, going way back to that adoption, moving away from dial-up internet into DSL and being part of the Microsoft venture to make internet available to the masses. I'm curious if you feel like there's any parallels you see now with generative AI and, coincidentally, Microsoft being at the hot seat of wanting to bring this technology and capability to the masses, and any parallels that you can draw having seen this happen before.
I think one parallel is, although everyone feared missing out, in the long run, it didn't turn out to be that problematic for most organizations not to be left out, because a whole ecosystem sprung into existence to take what was initially a very high bar and required a certain level of technology knowledge in order to get online. And a complete ecosystem got built out beneath that, from, America Online for folks who remember back that far, for folks who had no technology knowledge, all the way up to very advanced, close to the metal internet for folks who want to do something more custom. I see the same thing happening now with generative AI, that you're seeing brands getting built that specialize in a very opinionated way of doing things that's very easy. while at the same time you have more customization. I'm also fascinated. The other parallel I see is so many organizations are trying to centralize their AI smarts and their expertise and their subject matter gurus at this point. Reminds me very much of what happened with the internet early on. I mean, early on, being a cutting edge organization meant that you spun up an internet department, but less than 2 years after that, if you still had an internet department, you were in the dark ages, right? Because it went from the sort of thing where this is so important, we need to have some experts, to this is so important, we can't rely on just a small set of experts. Everybody needs to know it and use it on a daily basis. I think that's the parallel I see with generative AI.
And no doubt, I think we're in that early day. Gartner may call it the hype cycle, and it's kind of potentially overinvestment, or people kind of trying to make efficient something that they haven't learned enough about and made effective in the first place. Centers of excellence, I think, are a great example of something where it's hard to know how someone might have any level of excellence so early without having really strong business wins. That all being said, I think one area that we've certainly experimented a lot and seen a ton of wins is around enabling software development teams to write better code faster or test their code better using generative AI. And so tell us a little bit about your team at Fitch and how y'all are using generative AI.
Yeah. So on the software development side, I started the year with a mandate that by the end of the year, all of our software developers, got a team of about 600, would be empowered and using generative AI tools. We weren't exactly sure what to expect from it in terms of productivity boosts, but our early experimentation indicated it was going to be big. What we did as a kickoff, we took 4 or 5 of our recent university graduates, and at our big annual senior leadership meeting at the end of last year, we brought these fresh out of university employees up on stage and we sat them at a table, and we got from the audience a mandate of an application that they'd like to see built. And myself and my peers and our boss, Fitch's CIO, did our 15-minute apiece presentations leading up to an hour. And by the end of the hour, we were able to say, developers, have you finished the application? Then they built it. It's a little bit of circus. Never hurts, right? Showmanship is an important thing in business, as with anywhere. It was a real danger too, by the way. We had no backup plan. The backup plan, if it hadn't worked, would have been probably me running off the stage crying. Would have been the backup plan. But
burn the ships, I think they call that.
Burn the ships, exactly. Yeah. If you've got no alternative, you're going to make it. I guess we would have said that we failed fast, right? This is a fail fast culture, and we just failed. So, but yeah, and so they built this application, which just in that 1 hour did stuff that would have taken a squad probably a week prior to that. So that set our expectations fairly high, and we have been following the process of putting our AI generation coding tools of choice in front of all of our developers. This year, I sort of perceive as leading the horse to water. It's been a very prescriptive, supportive approach to say, here are the tools. Next year, I want to switch footing, and this is perhaps a piece of advice I would give. At some point in the inflection cycle, you have to switch from being prescriptive about the approach to, and this is true of all management, being prescriptive about the desired results. From what we have seen and from what the industry also reports, the productivity boosts associated with these tools can be anywhere from 20 to 50%, depending upon the nature of the developer. we see more productivity gains for the newer, less experienced developers, and it sort of tails off a little bit more as you get more towards experienced developers. But it never shrinks to zero, even with the most experienced of developers. And as a result, we're going to set our productivity targets double digits for next year, just based on the emergence of these tools. But it's a change in approach from saying, here are the tools, please use them, to saying, here's the expectation around productivity boost. Achieve that through whatever means you think is best, but we're saying we think these coded AI tools are the way to go.
I like that a lot. I think another adage that we hear more than we implement is to try and be, as leaders, more descriptive around where we want to get to versus prescriptive around how we're going to get there. And in this case, I also like that not only are you saying, hey, this is the level of efficiency improvement we're looking for through generative AI, you're saying, here's also an example of a team that's done it. So if you're having trouble getting started, then use them. But I imagine it also enables a lot of creativity in your team and allows them to also get to know the tool in their own way versus limiting it to how that initial team got to know it. And I have a hunch that maybe you've been surprised with teams that come back with more efficiencies or better outcomes than you described in the first place because you're taking multiple approaches. And I'm wondering if you have any examples of that or what you think of that hunch.
When I was starting to look for my the thing I wanted to do next after the big bank I worked at previously, one of the things, and this was 5 years ago, one of the things that really caught my interest and imagination about Fitch was that Fitch was already completely on the cloud. And in many cases, it wasn't a lift and shift. It was, hey, wait, this is cloud native stuff. Wow. Coming from the big bank I was at, that was like this cutting edge stuff. The piece that is still a core focus for us is around that whole DevOps cycle and trying to figure out how to push what are known in the industry as the DORA metrics. I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with them, but for those who aren't.
Yeah, maybe break it down for the few that may not have heard about the DORA metrics yet.
And this will be my pseudo layman's description of it, but you had Dr. Nicole Forsgren, who a number of years ago at Google, I believe it was, did a survey of thousands, and now it's tens of thousands of software engineering groups at different firms to find out how successful they were and what are different aspects of the way in which they build software. And this is all documented in a book called Accelerate, which when I joined Fitch, I actually bought a copy of the book for every single developer on my team. That's how important I thought it was, because what she and her team proved was if you chase 4 metrics, and if you are in the top performers in those 4 metrics, you will be measurably having happier customers, better commercial outcomes, you name it. Goodness seems to proceed from these 3 causative measures. And it's things like, how frequently do you release? How long does it take the customer to get what they ask for? How often do you have major incidences? And how long, when you have some sort of an incident, does it take you to correct it? So we've been super focused on pushing those 4 things of late. And in answer to the question that you asked about, have I been surprised by anything? The groups that have gotten big productivity boosts using things other than generative AI or in addition to generative AI tools have been the groups that perhaps had gotten their stuff onto the cloud, but it had been more of a lift and shift. And as a result, they weren't getting the real bang for the buck that we often think about with cloud deliveries, who have been able to go back and revisit what they built and realize, wow, if we made this, that, and the other change, there's no reason why we couldn't be doing 20 releases a day. Going back to our earlier conversation about iterative features, this whole idea that, hey, the customer asked us to move a button. We're not going to take that button move and put it into our next release a month from now. We're going to do that right now. Those sorts of what's known in the industry as continuous delivery seems to be the sweet spot. If I had to name one thing other than generative AI coding, getting that whole DevOps acumen around things like trunk-based development and feature flagging and all that sort of stuff, infrastructure as code, really empowering the development teams such that as soon as they finish a feature, they can immediately put it out there in production and do so safely. That's the other thing I would really flag up as a big area for productivity improvement.
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. I know a few teams that have implemented DORA. My team at Integral, we used to help do that with different customers, and we've got to experience varying levels of adoption, overcomplications, oversimplification. And I do think this is one of those rare cases where you get to hear that Da Vinci quote of simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And to your point, there was a lot of work and a lot of different candidates of metrics that ultimately got prioritized to these four that had the biggest impact. And it's also a very holistic approach where you can't overclock on one of them because they will usually end up showing in one of the other three unless you're doing things in a truly sustainable best practices way versus taking sort of short-term Band-Aids. So there's certainly something very beautiful around how the metrics have been organized and how they sort of have an implicit self-balancing nature to them if they're implemented correctly. I'm curious for the executives out there that are looking to implement DORA and get their teams on board, other than buying the book and making it a high priority, are there any gotchas or lessons learned or stories you can remember that might be helpful that can help folks avoid burning their fingers on what you burned your fingers on?
You cannot possibly spend too much time explaining why on any of this stuff. I mean, besides the fact that I just think it's good and humane and ethical for folks to understand the why behind the stuff that they're doing. And we always ask the business, could you tell us why we're building this? How's this going to benefit the customers? It's the same way with this purely technical stuff like the DORA metrics. And I remember some of the feedback early on, and I was responsible, I should say, for implementing the DORA metrics at my previous employer to Fitch also. So I've been through this in two organizations. And the same thing came up is the idea phrased as a challenge, which is, well, I could just game these metrics. You want to see us releasing code more frequently. Well, maybe I'll just release a code every time I write 3 lines of code. I'll just do a release for that. And the funny thing is, and what sort of needs to be explained is, that's not gaming the system. If you're releasing everything and it's properly able to be rolled back and it has good unit tests and you're actually able to get your code to production in the right setting, There's nothing gaming about that. That's actually the desired outcome, because I want everything that goes to production to be so small and focused and gradual that at any given point in time, if the customer looks at it and says, whoa, I don't like that, rather than us having put a big chunk out there every weekend or something, and now we have to figure out how do we take this piece out but leave the other pieces there. If we're constantly putting stuff out there and we have an issue here, then we can just take that piece out. That's not gaming the system. That's actually the desired outcome. I would also say spend some time talking about the metrics around production issues and the amount of time that it takes to resolve. And I've even fallen into the trap a little bit myself by saying production issues. The specific DORA metrics are around issues. How often do the changes that you make cause issues, and how long does it take you to undo them? In our case, we made the decision, starting out at least, that we're going to track major incidences that are caused by code changes. So we extract all of the issues that are like, the phone system went dead, or we lost power, or anything like that. All the stuff that's not under our control, we've made the decision to pull that out. Anything that's not a major incident, like things that our customers don't recognize, we don't count that either. Is that right? Is that wrong? For us, it's right now. Maybe it won't be right for us later on. Maybe it's not right for other organizations right now, but I would have that conversation and at least understand what you're going to do and the pros and cons of the approach that you choose, because those two metrics, I think, are a little bit more nebulous than the other ones, and it warrants some reflection around exactly how you're going to define that.
I love that a lot. And I'm going to ask a similar question, zooming out, about rolling out generative AI, of what are some cautionary tales or things that you may do differently the next time around, or for an executive as they're encouraging their team to get the benefits of generative AI in their product development?
Yeah, a community of practice will be tremendously helpful to an organization when they embark on this effort. You want to have natural champions, and you want to have a forum where people can share their successes, and also where they can share the things that haven't been successful for them. In our case, we work with a vendor. I think I can say the name. It's Amazon AWS. We've chosen Q Developer. We have a great relationship with Amazon where we are able to tell them issues that we're having and get that sort of, support to say, well, have you tried doing it this way? Have you tried doing it that way? And even in some cases, hey, this would be a super useful feature for us, and get that into the backlog to see it incorporated in the products. I think in general, when you evaluate products, but particularly in the generative AI space now, because it's so rapidly developing, don't get hung up comparing the feature check marks between the different products exclusively and choosing the one that currently has the most check marks, because the space is so rapidly developing that, we've seen it with the models, right? It's like, oh, hey, GPT, OpenAI, they have the best model. Oh, no, wait, Claude just leapfrogged them. Oh, wait, this week it's back to OpenAI. Now it's Llama. This every week somebody else is on top. So what you really want to do in choosing these AI tools is work with a partner or choose a consumer-facing product that you think has the potential to be stable and to provide good support in the long term. Because if you just choose based on the current feature set, you are guaranteed to have buyer's remorse probably the week after you make that choice because things are evolving so quickly. But then a few weeks later, you might be glad again that you got that. And then, 2 months later, you might be sad because the competition is evolving so quickly here. Choose your partnerships more based on the strength of the partner and your relationship with them than the current state of affairs for any one product, I would say.
You mentioned a community of practice, and we talked about centers of excellence earlier. They sound similar, but I tend to think they're pretty different. And I'd love to hear from your perspective how you maybe want to make sure you're fostering a community of practice here, and maybe it's a little too soon for a center of excellence.
Yeah, I think both have a definite role. The community of practice, to me, some people call it a birds of a feather. Some people call it a guild. That's probably the more agile parlance for something is a guild, but it's really about co-support, that people are coming together because they have a genuine interest in whatever the topic at hand is, and they are going to share successes so that other people can imitate their successes, and they're going to share challenges because maybe someone else has encountered the same challenge and worked through it, and they can help each other and say, oh, here's how I solved that on my end. On the other hand, a center of excellence, I tend to think as being more a set of SMEs who are tasked with the idea of putting forward specific patterns and practices and providing more of a sort of second tier of support for things. So like a center of excellence in the case of Gen AI coding would be the folks who are responsible for the upgrade and probably the relationship with the vendor that provides us given set of tools. So they'd be the ones who would be saying, okay, we're going to switch the model now. We're comfortable enough with GPT 4.0 that we're going to get off of GPT 3 next week. Everyone get ready. Here's the guidance in terms of how you would change any of the stuff you've already built on GPT 3, so on and so forth. One, I tend to think of centers of excellence as being more top-down, and communities of practice are a little bit more federated.
Flat, yeah, for sure.
And peers.
And I'd never thought of it that way, but I'm thinking maybe the community of practice tends to have faster moving innovation, and maybe is more like playing offense, whereas a center of excellence makes sure that there's sort of checks and balances that, let's make sure everyone is adopting it, and the versions are ones that we trust. Of course, with generative AI, we have to be fairly careful about where we're putting what in terms of if you have a private instance, a public instance, and everything else that goes with that, which defense is also important in order to grow in a structured way. And something I hadn't necessarily thought of in that way, and I'm curious if you tend to agree with that or not.
Yeah, it's interesting. You touched on the idea of generative AI and whether you have a private instance or a public instance and knowing the difference between the two. I see a parallel there with the start of the internet also, that part of the reason that you had these, internet centers of excellence back in, say, the mid to late 90s that were passé by the start of the 2000s, reverse proxies coming into existence and becoming more widely deployed did a lot of the work that those internet committees did before, right? Like initially there was the thought that, well, what we'll do is we'll have a central list of all of the approved websites. It's we'll have the white list or the good list that folks will be able to use, and we'll have the bad list of things that are absolutely broken or absolutely forbidden. And then very quickly there was a technology solution that said, well, wait, why don't we just have that as a service? And you put this here, and this will make sure that nothing goes out that you don't want going out, and nothing will come in, and vice versa. I think you're seeing very much the same sort of thing happen with AI technologies now. All of this stuff around building guardrails, both for internal users of AI And so in the case of Fitch, for example, in our, we sell financial research amongst other things, Fitch Solutions, and there is the functionality now in a couple of our paywall sites to go in and ask questions and get a response from an agent, and it'll go and it'll look through all of the research and say, here's the answer to your question. Those guardrails that didn't exist as a service when we started building that functionality, by the time we were done, just a few months later, had come into existence, and all the stuff that we were doing to say, well, we don't want to support our customers asking questions like this or this or this. That code sort of, we don't need that. Now we just use the guardrail service that's provided in the cloud. I think that is the way of technologies like this, that it just, they grow and more stuff just becomes table stakes, I guess you'd call it, right?
Speaking of generative AI, going back to your music background, you're in a band, and I think there's applications out there like Suno AI that are composers, and the jury's a little bit out on that. But at the same time, maybe we can apply the same analogy of how your software engineering team is way more efficient as a result of it. And I'm curious if you've dabbled in bringing generative AI into when you wear your music and band hat.
I like to use ChatGPT as a sort of very sophisticated thesaurus. Like, I can ask it, tell me all of the word rhymes that are associated with the following topic. And it can come back with a list of rhymes, which you couldn't really do with a thesaurus, right? Because a thesaurus, it can give you rhymes, but it doesn't know themes or anything like that. So to me, that's a great tool, but it's not turning over the creative keys to essentially an automaton, right? It still gives me the flexibility as a human being to say, you've given me the raw materials, here's how I want to use them. I'll tell you one other thing. There's a product called RipX, which uses an AI algorithm to take recorded songs and break them back apart into their constituent pieces. So if you've got keyboards, drums, guitar, bass, vocals, say, you can feed a song through RipX and it will give you just the bass or just the guitar or just the vocals. And so like in my case, as you can see from behind me, drums is sort of my primary instrument. I love being able to feed songs into that and take the drums out. And then it's an electronic drum set, so I put it through my headphones. I'm able to play drums along with pretty much any song I love. I love that experience. I've never used it to actually create music, though. That to me is just one bridge too far.
Well, while we're on the topic, and while you've avoided composing music or making songs using AI, I sense that there might be a fear that you have around what might happen with the industry. And I'm curious if you've got any things that you would hope wouldn't come to reality.
I'm actually super optimistic in the area of technology and AI. I hear from time to time from software engineers, have I chosen the wrong profession because our computer's going to be doing all the coding going forward, if you can get this. And I am constantly reminded of a lunch that I had with the man who was Microsoft's head of developer tooling for many years. Soma was his name. There is so much demand for technologists, for good technologists who are able to understand a requirement that might not be perfect, have the clarifying conversations that you and I have talked about today, get it to a point where it can actually be built, and then built in a good way that's secure and easily expandable, etc., etc. And what I think will happen with this profusion of tools is maybe initially you do see a little bit of a dip in demand because now you've enabled non-developers to come into the fray and put together these version 0.1s of their applications. But if history is any guide, and I think it is, 5 years from now, 6 years from now, however, long, I don't think it's long term, it's more medium term, you're going to see an explosion of need for software engineers unlike anything we've ever seen before. Because what winds up happening is supply drives demand. You will get a lot of folks who come in and get their ideas 90% done, but that last 10% really needs somebody who has a software engineer's knowledge and discipline. And then the thing is, I think that these ideas that are 90% done will sadly probably be 50% in the wrong direction. So there's going to be that rework that needs to be done to say, boy, if you'd brought us in earlier, we could have, we would have done this, that, and the other thing. So there's going to be, and then besides that as a feature, we're going to have people thinking about putting software places software has never existed before, because there will be such a there will be this profusion of ability. Therefore, it might initially bring the cost down of software development to say, hey, let's put software in this kind of a device. Let's put software in that kind of device. What if we had software that did this, 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 and this? Then because you have all these places that are running software that never ran it before, that contributes into the demand for having experienced software engineers also. So, boy, I tend to be an optimist in life in general, but in this case, I am insanely optimistic. Yes, it is going to drive the supply of software, but that supply is going to drive the demand like I think nothing we've seen before. So if you've chosen to go into software as a career, you've made the right choice. This is the place to be.
I tend to agree with you a lot. And I think the advice I might give that engineer is also to think about what you said earlier on around understanding core problems that you're solving for a customer, understanding some of the business model or the viability aspects of it, things that maybe software engineers felt like we were shielded from or not interested in. Those are things that I think we can get way closer to now. And we're going to have much more higher fidelity clickable prototypes, if you will, that do more than being prototypes and are functioning software. But once we have to get beyond that, I think we're going to need real horsepower beyond the AI to scale and integrate and everything else. But I think the number of ideas that can be tested are so much more beyond what a clickable prototype could do and now actual working software, as much as what's behind the surface maybe doesn't scale or isn't necessarily as reliable. But it proves out that idea of, does this customer workflow actually work? Can we build a business out of this? At which point there's a much better gate on what do we expend the human engineering prowess into. But to your point, there's just so many more ideas as a result of the supply that there's going to be better ideas that float up to the top of that cream of the crop. Appreciate you spending time with us here today. One of the questions that I love to ask all our guests is, what a recent product or a service has been, either at work or at home, that has blown your socks off, that you've been totally delighted by?
So Flux AI as a competitor to any of the, I mentioned Dolly earlier, competitor to that, Stable Diffusion. I've had super good results with it. And in combination with a cloud capacity service called Replicate, which...
What does Replicate do?
Well, so I made the investment in a very high-end MacBook personally. And it's not the easiest thing in the world to use with GPUs. And at the time I bought it, for whatever reason, I didn't think about GPUs. And Apple MacBooks are notoriously difficult to upgrade also. It's sort of like you buy it with the capacity that you're going to get, and then if you need more capacity, get something different, right? Replicate is a really, really super easy to use partial GPU capacity service where you can write a Python script on your desktop, and then there are some APIs you can call that will run it remotely, but you only get charged for the GPU capacity that you actually use rather than having to pay for it in, like an hour at a time or whatever. You could do the same thing with, I think, pretty much any cloud service, but just the simplicity of it. So many things, particularly in the area of generative AI, because it's evolving so quickly. The technology evolves quicker than the documentation. And so you spend a lot of time trying to do trial and error to get something to work. What I've noticed about Replicate is they do a really good job of staying on top of their documentation so that when you try to do something, it works the way that it says in the documentation. You don't spend a bunch of time trying to figure out, well, should I be on version 1.5.6? Oh no, I should be on version 1.5.5. I need to roll back because something changed, but the documentation isn't up to date yet. So the relevance to me having a MacBook is, rather than having to go out and buy a very expensive Windows tower with a bunch of GPU capacity and all that sort of stuff, I just made the decision, hey, I'm just going to run my stuff on Replicate and pay that fractional cloud percentage for GPU rather than having standing cycles that I probably wouldn't be using. Been super impressive to me, and it's probably saved me a boatload in terms of processing power too and what I'd have to pay for it. So that will be my choice.
So what is the best way for folks to get a hold of you?
You're welcome to contact me on LinkedIn. Always happy to chat with fellow professionals there. That's usually my window to the world. And I do a fair bit of conference speaking. So if you happen to be at a conference where I'm speaking, please do come up and introduce yourself.
We'll make sure to have a link to those tools as well as your LinkedIn in the show notes. And then the last thing I'd like to put in the show notes is, how can we listen to your music or catch a show of your band?
So Refa Stramus on Spotify, YouTube Music, Apple Music, so on and so forth. Our next gig is actually next November, so maybe we'll get something before then. But we've got a slot opening for Asia. If folks remember that band from the '80s, in the UK, it's the HRH Prague Festival 15. So, you're welcome to look it up. Thanks for asking. That's cool.
Hey, Derek, thank you so much for making the time. It was really wonderful to chat with you. I'm sure there's a lot of tidbits for the audience there. I know I learned a lot.
Thank you. It was super great talking to you.
I thought that was a really great share from Derek at Fitch. I really wish we'd had more time to dive further into DORA metrics specifically, as I think it can be a really powerful way to measure the progress on your teams. Our team at Integral used to see new leadership, especially at some of our larger customers, often come in and introduce something like DORA without offering a ton of guidance to the teams. I appreciate Derek's approach personally, where there's an initial step of starting out being prescriptive about the approach of the process, and then shifting to being descriptive about the desired outcomes to let the teams discover the best path. I think that initial step is sometimes overlooked and is especially important for new leaders, especially at large teams, where that initial guidance can outweigh that risk that we all feel of coming across as micromanagers. Coming back to DORA, the acronym DORA stems from the DevOps Research and Assessment team at Google, where the research originated. And I think there are 4 things that we have seen time and time again that can really have a disproportional impact on improving your DORA metrics. The first one's obvious in a DevOps context around CI/CD. I think many teams excel at the continuous integration part, but hesitate at full CD or continuous deployment and stopping short of production. I really like encouraging the teams to take ownership of eliminating bugs early without relying on the safety net of a manual QA team, in that it builds really strong responsibility on the team and also broadens the focus of your teammates beyond the individual task to the entire system's value to your customers. The second one is test automation. Comprehensive automated testing is crucial, but I still find it to be overlooked or optional on product teams. I personally love test-driven development to help teams write better tests, of course, and ensure high test coverage, but more importantly, align technical and business goals. I think TDD fosters richer conversations between teams, like business and technology, and bridges the gap so that you can ultimately build better products faster. The third one is a good segue, is that close relationship between business and technology. Strong collaboration and deep trust allows for things like thin slicing requirements, which turns large deployments into smaller, frequent releases. And from a DORA standpoint, it obviously reduces lead times, minimizes change failure impacts, and improves things like mean time to restore when your issues will inevitably come to being. The last and final one is context sharing on your development team. Ensuring that more team members understand the code base helps mitigate risks, prioritize technical debt the right way, and foster a better emergent architecture as your system and your customer grows. More informed teams can restore systems faster and make smarter design choices. And personally, we had a lot of benefit from using pair programming or mob programming in a pragmatic way to help create a safe environment for everyone to get familiar with the system in an efficient and sustainable way. Given the importance of these topics, we're going to definitely explore these further in a future episode. And for now, you can check out a blog post on DORA metrics that we did at Integral that is linked in the show notes. Thanks a lot, as always, folks, for listening to this part 2 with Derek Ferguson from Fitch. We will be back next Tuesday, as always, with another episode on fostering the most engaged product teams who shipped the most delightful products. In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence Podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.